It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I honestly have no explanation for it. My boyfriend and I were on a bit of a road trip, traveling to see my parents the next state over. They had never met him, despite the two of us having dated for almost 2 years. He had proposed to me the week before, my mother seeing the pictures on Instagram, and she had asked when they were finally going to get to meet this mystery boy I intended to marry. I hated that I didn't get to see my mom as much these days. My dad and I had a bit of a falling out before I moved, but he was looking to reconcile, and I was looking for some closure before my marriage to the sweetest man I'd ever met. We were driving, the countryside sliding past, and I felt myself drifting off as I just sat there and took it in. "Feeling like a little nap, babe?" he asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I think I might close my eyes for a second or two." "Well, okay. I'm going to stop for some food soon. 20 winks at the most," he joked. I stuck my tongue out at him and let my eyes slip shut as I blocked out the cows and the green fields that went sliding past the window. When I opened my eyes, the landscape was very different. The sky was red, like burnt red, the color of a jack-o'-lantern, and it seemed to be crackling with heat lightning as I watched. Something was falling from it, something bright that trailed a long tail. They almost looked like comets, but they were too close. We were on the road, but it was pitted and old. The concrete was flaked and peeling, and the landscape was eroded and rocky. Despite this, yellow crops grew from the arid soil, and I could see strange brown creatures with bloated bodies moving along on scaly legs. None of it was right. We should be traveling through Midwestern farmland, and the lightning was rumbling again. I saw it hit the ground and leave a crater amidst the too dry vegetation. I looked to Brad for some kind of answers, but as upsetting as the landscape was, Brad was the most upsetting thing about this, whatever it was. He stared ahead, eyes on the road, as he sat stock still and stared through the window as if it were completely normal. "Brad? What the hell, where the hell are we?" He stared ahead and said nothing. "Brad, what's going on?" He stared ahead, and as I watched, something seemed to move beneath his cheek. I was scared. He was so still, but I found myself unable to look away. Brad was a joker, but he didn't usually joke like this. This was different. This was making me very afraid, and I started to worry about something being wrong with him. Then, ever so slightly, he turned his head, and I found myself wishing he had just stayed facing forward. His eyes were jet black, too big and starey. His face was locked in the rictus of a smile, and it seemed he was having some sort of fit. His skin was moving, writhing, and as I watched, a large black beetle slid from his mouth and scuttled into his ear. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me. I became aware of how quiet it was, only the thunder making any noise as it struck outside the window, and the silence was a whole other monster that lurked. It became claustrophobic, like those parts in a horror movie where you're waiting for the monster to scream and scare you so you can just get on with the story. The scream never came. The scare never happened, and I just sat and looked at this thing as it drove us towards wherever we were going. As we sat staring at each other, however, the car was invaded by the sound of a loud, cavernous scream. I turned in time to see our vehicle barreling towards something large and gray that was walking laboriously across the road. I only saw it for a split second, but it was huge, and the thing we were careening towards was a leg that seemed to take up the whole road. Its skin was craggy, like a living mountain, and as it tried to ponderously get its bulk out of the road, we hit it squarely, and the car made a sound like an angry animal. The crash happened in slow motion. The vehicle's front crunched in, lifting us off the ground as the windshield bulged in. The bubble slowly grew before bursting, pushing inward like a rising wave. The glass shattered out like a cascade of beautiful diamonds as it pelted toward my face. Through it all, those dark eyes glared into my soul. He maintained eye contact until I woke up, screaming as the pain radiated up my face. I heard a screech of tires and an angry exclamation from my boyfriend as I came to. The car swerved back onto the road, and I clutched my nose and screamed. The pain was instant and mind-numbing, shooting agony that radiated through my nose and spread through my face. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going on. Through my tear-streaked eyes, I could see that everything was back to the way it was before I dozed off. Had it all been a dream? My throbbing nose kind of made me think that it had been real. The pain was becoming too much, and I begged him to take me to a hospital. He obliged as best he could, and 20 minutes later, we walked into the ER lobby in the nearest town. It was a slow day, I suppose, because they let us back and asked me questions as I helped them fill out paperwork. They didn't leave us sitting in the room for long either. In no time at all, someone was taking my hand off my face, and my boyfriend was holding my arms to keep me from trying to cover it again. I wanted to cover my face again badly, my nose a white-hot ball of agony, and the touch of Brad's hand was making me shudder. I couldn't look at him, because despite knowing that it was a dream, all I could see was that bug-filled creature with dead eyes looking back at me. The doctor looked into my left nostril with a light and furrowed his brow. That's weird. Hold very still for a second. Brad held me, wrapping his body around me, which only made me shudder worse, as the doctor reached into my nose and pulled something out that seemed to cut me as it came free. My nose hurt all the worse, like it was being sliced with a razor blade, and as it came free of my nose, I could see that it had been what was causing me the pain. It glittered wetly, red drops dappling the edges of the object as it slid out into the light of day. It was a shard of glass, about as long as my pinky tip, and nearly as wide. They had a lot of questions I couldn't answer, and Brad was utterly bewildered as to how it had gotten in my nose in the first place. I can't explain it myself. It was as if I had dozed off perfectly fine and woke up with a huge piece of glass in my face. I told them about the dream, but that didn't seem to convince them in the least bit. I simply gained a giant piece of glass somehow. No one seems to be able to tell me why. That's why I'm writing this, honestly. I sent Brad out to get me some clothes from the car, but I don't know if I can even get back in the car with him. Sometimes he looks normal, but sometimes, just for a second, I can see that weird thing staring out of his face. The other subs I put this in seem to think it was a joke, but you guys seem to appreciate weird stuff, so any advice would be greatly appreciated. I just don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to drive for another 2 hours with him. I don't know what's going on, or if I'll ever get over this. I met my husband when we were in college together. I was working on my bachelor's degree, helping out in the library for some needed extra cash, when I first laid eyes on him. He was not the usual sort of man I fancied, more bookish than muscly. I found him charming in his own way, and we struck up a friendship. He told me he was a writer, that he was working on a book of short stories to submit to a publishing house. I offered to read them, and from that moment on, I became his biggest fan. His stories were so visceral. He wrote not as a writer, but as a first-hand observer, and it wasn't long before his work was noticed. We were living together by then, our library friendship having blossomed into something more, and I could see how giddy he was when the letters came in from Bowding Publishing. When he read how they wanted to publish his book, I think it was the proudest moment of his life. He kept writing for Bowding, his stories finding a niche with the horror community. He also started selling his pieces to magazines and online sources, getting his name out there and becoming more recognizable. As his fame grew, however, he still jokingly called me his biggest fan. I couldn't argue with him. I genuinely loved his work. He wrote the sort of stories that were genuinely terrifying and enticed the reader to keep reading until the very end. As his stories grew in number, I found myself curious about where they all came from. My husband, we'll call him Michael, was a mild-mannered fellow who had never really experienced anything horrifying in his life. He described his childhood as benign, no broken bones or funny uncles. His family was loving and doted on him constantly. He had never been without. He had never really suffered, and I found myself very curious about where all these nightmares came from in such a beautiful mind. Then, over drinks one night, he told me. He didn't like to talk about, where he got the stories from, not when he was sober. He always said that discussing the creative process was boring, or that his story's technical aspects would bore me to tears. I wasn't fooled, though. Beneath his jokes was something colder, something fearful. So one night I pressed him. He still didn't really want to talk about it, but I persisted. Finally, after a lot of coaxing and some strong whiskey, he all but blurted his answer to me. I wish now that I hadn't asked. "It's the door," he said, and at that moment he seemed almost afraid of his own words. The door? I was confused by the queerness of his answer. What do you dream about?" He asked the question so suddenly, I was taken by surprise. "Oh, I don't know. Normal things, I guess. What I did the day before, movies I've watched, weird things my mind cooks up. I've only ever had the same dream my entire life. It's always the same. It never changes. It's where I get all my ideas." I leaned forward, intrigued by what he was telling me. He seemed emboldened by my attention. "The door lies in space. At least I believe it must be space. It floats in a great void, and every night I visit it. I float through this void naked, an umbilicus connecting me to whatever lies beyond. Every night I approach the door, and every night it whispers to me through the keyhole. Do you remember the little journal on my bedside?" I nodded, begging him to go on with my eyes. "I've trained myself to write the things I hear while sleeping. Sometimes I see pictures or faces when I look through the keyhole. Sometimes I hear terrible words spoken by creatures I imagine to be beyond my description. Sometimes I have to close my eyes and will myself awake because I'm afraid that the things they tell me will drive me insane. When I wake up, I read what I've written down, which becomes my stories." I was shocked. "So all your stories come from this big door in space?" He smiled at me. "It sounds silly when you say it like that, but yes, everything I've ever written was spoken to me by something on the other side of that door." I didn't think anything of it the next day. We'd been drunk, and he had just spouted off something to make me shut up. I was sure of it. I became more aware of his journal, though. Sometimes at night he would wake me up with the scritch-scratch of his pen on the page. I didn't like to look at him when he was writing it. It was like something otherworldly had taken his strings and was using him without his permission. Watching him write in that fugue state made me feel uncomfortable, and I took measures not to be awake while it was going on. I didn't think anything else of this, not until about 3 months ago. That was when he started having the nightmares. His work had always been creepy, always terrifying, but now it took on an alarming quality. He began talking about creatures that lived beyond the door. These creatures sounded more than a little Lovecraftian, and he was assured that their presence on Earth was an affront to the natural order. They came and went, their arrivals marked by some with great portents, and their battles had shaped history. The stories weren't the only thing that changed, though. He began to sleep poorly. His sleep had always been placid, peaceful, but now he thrashed and mumbled in his sleep. He whimpered in the night about the pale lady or the green man and the riotous red that surged like blood. The words he wrote in his journal were unreadable, a foreign language, but he sat and scribbled them, transcribed them every morning like a dutiful follower of some religion. He began to change. His eyes bore huge bags. He was jumpy and unsure of himself, and more than once I caught him catnapping fitfully during the day. His writing, however, was more in demand than ever. The magazines he wrote for wanted more stories about these strange old ones. His editor wanted to publish a compilation of them at once. He had no lack of material for the book, but I began to get worried about his health as he proceeded. We had been married for 2 years then, just starting to make a life together, and I was afraid that his candle would burn out before mine. I asked him one night to stop writing the stories. He was at his computer, typing away dutifully, when I made the request. He turned his head to look at me, haunted eyes boring into mine, and laughed for the first time in weeks. It wasn't his laugh, though. The laughter was jagged and full of despair, humor shared only by the damned. He laughed like a madman. I can't. If I stop writing, they won't like it. Who? I asked in confusion. The ones behind the door. They've marked me as their chronicler. I can't stop until the job is done. These things are killing you. Can't you see that, Michael? He slumped over his keyboard, resting his head against it, making a line of letters as he did so. Don't you think I would if I could? If I could stop, I would give so much to stop. The things they tell me, no one should have to know these things. It's fruit from the poison tree, and I wish I did not have the knowledge that they've given me. Then stop, I said suddenly. Just stop writing. Tell them you refuse to write their story. He looked horrified. Refuse them? I've never refused a story before. What if it stops the door from working? I turned him in his chair and pulled him to me. The door is in your mind, love. The way it manifests is nothing more than your own mind working through your stories. The monsters are of your own making. You control them. They don't control you. At that moment, he looked relieved. He hugged me back and seemed on the verge of tears. I don't think he had ever thought of those nightly excursions as anything but in a literal sense. He had never imagined that these things could be of his own creation, and the knowledge had made him feel free. I'll tell them tonight, then, he said with a smile on his face. I'll tell them that I don't want to write about them anymore. I'll tell Fred that I don't want to continue these stories in the morning. He won't like it, but he'll understand. He went to bed then, and I figured that would be the end of the nightmares. I was wrong. He woke me in the middle of the night, screaming. The back of his hand hit me in the face, and I rolled awake to the sound of him screaming. He was thrashing around, clutching his stomach and kicking his legs frantically. I tried to wake him. I know everything says not to do that, but I wanted him to wake up. I slapped his face. I threw water on him. I screamed his name, but nothing worked. Someone banged on the door, but I ignored them. I tried in every way I could to help my husband. Finally, he helped himself. We were in the ER. The knocking person had called the paramedics, and they had burst in. They thought someone was being murdered, but they loaded him up and took him straight to the hospital when they saw what was going on. He lay in an ER bed, screaming and kicking until they finally restrained him. He went right on thrashing and yelling until nearly 4 a.m. Then he gasped loudly, like a diver coming up from a deep depth, and seemed to come awake. They cut my umbilicus, he said in a tone of the most profound sorrow. They moved him upstairs later that day. The doctor who talked to him was afraid that he might hurt himself, and I was a little worried too. For the next 2 days, he sat strapped to a hospital bed, fighting sleep. He couldn't sleep, he told me, because he would have no way back without his umbilicus. I would be lost forever, and my consciousness would float forever in that void. He told me how he had told the thing behind the door that he would no longer write its story. I had assured him that it was all in his head, that it was a product of his imagination. When it had burst through the door and screamed, he knew it was all too real. He had run then, fled across the void, but the creature had wings and it had chased him. It defies description. Its legs were equine, its head like living rock. Its body was made of stars. I don't know, dear. Its mouth was full of fiery teeth, and when it lunged at me, I could do nothing but flee. As he had run, the thing had slashed at him. The clawed hand had torn at his umbilicus.
Michael said a pain like a rending scythe had torn through his belly, and as he writhed, he could see the fiery teeth sever the root from him. He had caught the end then, using the last of his strength to grab the trailing end, and pulled himself out of the dark place, a little at a time. He was afraid after that, afraid to go back, afraid of what might be waiting there for him. He fought sleep for the next 3 days. He would nod and awaken, but it seemed harder for him to come back every time. He begged his doctor for caffeine pills, for coffee, for anything to keep him awake, but the doctors thought sleep would be the best drug for him. They fiddled with the idea of sedating him, but I forbade it. When they threatened to get the police involved, thinking I was somehow responsible for this, I threatened to call a lawyer. Finally, we reached a shaky standoff. It was moot after day 3. I lost the fight first, drifting off as I sat by his bedside. When I awoke, he was gone. He's in the ICU now. His coma is deep, and the doctors are afraid he might have suffered a stroke. They don't know about his nightly travels. Wouldn't believe me if I told them. But I know what's been happening to him. He's adrift in the void now, maybe already dead at the hands of this elder thing, and there's nothing I can do to get him back. But maybe there is something you all can do. My husband could not be the only one traveling to this place. Some of you must have heard the whispers through the door as well. If you see this door, and if you find my husband, please bring him back. I don't know how you would, but please try. And if the creatures on the other side of the door talk to you about things from the other side, please do yourself a favor and listen to them. Don't ever stop listening to them. I wish I had never told him to stop listening. The price you pay for ignoring them might be your life. The price might even be steeper than that.
My brother and I work for a cleaning company in our hometown. We're both still in high school. He's a junior and I'm a senior, so it was either this or fast food. The owner is a friend of Dad's. We'll call him Chuck to protect the innocent. Chuck's a nice enough guy. My brother and I have known him since we were young, but he leaves a lot to be desired as a businessman. Don't misunderstand. The guy makes money, but he seems to think that employee safety comes after profit. My brother and I worked like dogs for him all summer, cleaning out people's yards and moving boxes out of abandoned houses. Anything to make a buck, I guess. It was nearly July when Chuck got a call from another of his old friends, Philip O'Dare. If Chuck is a little underhanded in his business practices, then Philip is a goddamn pirate. He's the town's #1 real estate agent, and I mean everything when I say that he sells everything. He owns a pawn shop, Broke Brokers, with his younger brother. When he wasn't out selling houses, he was looking for homes to buy. The homes he picks up are rough, most of the time. If he were selling them a fixer-upper, that would be okay. The problem is that after he picks up these houses for next to nothing, he does shoddy Band-Aid repairs on them. Then he sells them for top prices, usually to pick them back up a few years later when the occupants move out in disgust. My current situation is thanks in part to Philip's underhanded renovations and Chuck's less than stellar business sense. The Foskey place? I asked. I didn't even know Mr. Foskey was dead. Chuck looked up from his notepad, his gray hair making him look like a cloud with glasses. He's not. Foskey's son sent him to Golden View and sold his house to O'Dare Real Estate. That made me a little sad. Mr. Foskey had been my English teacher when I was in middle school, and he had also taught Dad when he was in 8th grade. My brother had not been what you would call an advanced English compatible student, so he didn't get him. But Dad and I both agreed that Mr. Foskey was the best. He always had such cool lesson plans and exciting books in his class library. He challenged his advanced students to be more than a title and wanted us to be more than just A-plus students. I was sad to hear that he had been fired a couple of years ago. He had started to get a little senile in his old age. Everyone said so. And his taste in books had always been a little esoteric. After he'd been fired, he'd become a hermit. He only came out at night, and the word around town was that he'd been going through people's garbage. What he sought was anyone's guess, but People came to visit him and said his house was full of junk. Now he was gone, off to the mental hospital in the next town, and we were left to clean up his house. Phil says to save anything that looks valuable. Apparently the guy had a ton of old books that were probably worth money. Foskey's son sold Phil the house and everything in it, so don't bother saving anything sentimental. A couple of weeks in the puzzle factory and the old man probably won't even remember his own name. I left before I could say anything stupid. The thought of a brilliant man like Mr. Foskey losing his mind in a place like Golden View made me sick at the time. Now, I think it might be exactly what he deserves. We arrived at 6 a.m. Philip was waiting for us, a cell phone against his ear and a latte in his other hand. He was dressed in his usual blue suit, and I imagine we looked pretty shabby next to him, in our jeans and black t-shirts with the company name on them. My brother had rolled the sleeves up on his motorcycle boots peeking out from beneath the cuffs of his new jeans. He was going through some kind of James Dean phase, but it really just made him look like an extra in Grease. We waited for Philip to finish, and when he did, he looked at us like we were in the way. "Well, what are you waiting for?" "A breakdown on what exactly we're doing," I said a little hotly. "I thought you boys were smart. Clean the damn house and save what can be sold. Old bastard bought the house 5 years ago after his kids moved out. It's a 1-bedroom, 1-bath, and I have a client who wants to see it Wednesday, so if you could not take all week about it, that would be great. We'll take a look and let you know by the end of the day, okay?" He scoffed again, clearly saving all that charm for his clients. "Just have it done. I'll pay you double if you can finish it by Wednesday. You, not your boss." That was a tempting offer. Chuck was great, but he tended to be a little tight with the checks. We were being paid under the table, so we couldn't really argue. But some extra cash would be sweet. I shook Philip's hand, and he said to have it done by Wednesday. He nodded and left, the sound of his T-bird cutting up the road as he went. I immediately regretted my words when I saw inside the house. The house had a strange floor plan. There was a living room, a dining room with a bar that overlooked from the kitchen. Off the kitchen was a bathroom, and a door to get out back where you could sit in a small backyard. Off the living room was another door that I guessed was to the bedroom. The house had a strange sort of feel to it when you came inside, and I could believe that such a place would draw Mr. Foskey to it. It was eccentric in a practical way, a way that he would have understood. The living room dining room was full of trash and furniture, stuffed floor to ceiling, and I could see a little walkway from the living room to the kitchen. The kitchen was spared the worst of it, but it was still covered in garbage. The floor was a solid foot of garbage, the cabinets were covered in old food wrappers, and the refrigerator seemed clean, though it wouldn't open due to the junk on the floor. The cabinets were stuffed with garbage, and I sighed as I thought about the job at hand. This looked like a good week's worth of work between the living room and the kitchen alone. "I'll take the kitchen, you take the living room. Whoever finishes first will help the other." "Why do you get the kitchen?" I rolled my eyes at him. "I see a lot of furniture in there, football star. You got Dad's build, so you do the heavy lifting." "Guess that means you got Mom's build, so I guess you can get your bitch ass in the kitchen," he said with a laugh. We put on our respirators, rubber boots, and thick gloves. We hadn't seen anything that would make us break out the hazmat suits yet, but I like to be safe. We were definitely working with some old refuse, possibly refuse that had been outside, which meant that rodents were a danger, as well as insects. We were cleaning out a shed like this not even a month ago, and ran upon a secret hornet's nest. That had made us wary about attacking big mounds of trash, so I was careful to look where I was putting my hands as I started in the kitchen. I got lucky. The trash was mostly dry and clean, and it was easily bagged up. I heard my brother straining and grunting in the living room, and I looked out to see him wrestling with a sizable piece of furniture. He was dragging it out onto the lawn. Philip had a mobile storage unit pointing out front, and then loading them into the unit. I watched him groan as he tried to lift an antique dining room table, which had been the linchpin on a large pile of garbage before going to help him. The pile fell over as we freed the table, and I helped him lug it out onto the yard. This is how we spent our first day, at least till mid-afternoon. By 4, I had all the garbage out of the kitchen. My brother had gotten most of the furniture out of the living room, and was wiping sweat off his brow as he stuffed papers into a bag. "Doesn't this guy have AC?" "I haven't seen a thermostat. Maybe it's in the bedroom." My brother stood up and walked to the door, coming off the living room. As he opened it, I heard him whistle and came to see what he had found. Inside the bedroom was a tunnel of solid junk. It snaked to the left, getting dim inside, and the tunnel looked as though someone had cut it out of solid junk. "You sure you want to go in there?" I asked. He just rolled his eyes and took a pen light out of his pocket. "This shouldn't take long," he said as he tromped into the room. I stood for a few seconds, making sure the whole pile wouldn't just fall over, and went back to work in the kitchen. I should have gone with him, maybe been a little more attentive, but I was in a hurry and really wanted to have a look at the bathroom before quitting time. I got all the garbage bags out of the cabinets, stuffed 6 bags with nothing but trash. I unearthed the sink and the microwave and had started cleaning the countertops when I noticed something wasn't right. The trash was still in the same place my brother had left it, and the door to the bedroom still hung open. Was he still in there? There was no way it had taken him an hour to navigate the bedroom and find the thermostat. I called his name into the bedroom. The name almost seemed to echo down the trash hall, but there was no answer. It was starting to get close to sunset, and I really wanted to be out of here before dark. Thinking maybe he had fallen or gotten hurt in there, I grabbed a headlamp and headed into the trash maze. I turned the corner and was bombarded by the claustrophobia of the trash tunnel. The tunnel was a solid mass of trash that seemed almost sculpted. It was like someone had built a wall out of mortar and trash and then cut a tunnel out of it. There was a soft light coming from the garbage wall, and when I turned off my headlamp, I found I could see. The dim light seemed to be coming from something inside the wall, but even with the headlamp on, I couldn't tell what it was. It made navigating the strange, winding maze a little easier, but the size started to unsettle me as I moved. The bedroom was supposedly 12 by 12, but this maze seemed to be winding on farther than the whole house. I'd been taking turns for several minutes when I came upon the first strange sight. Coming around a bend, I came face to face with a small library. A small grotto held 4 bookcases, stuffed with old-looking books. Many of them were covered in mold, and as I got close, I could see bugs moving across them. I backed away and kept walking, not sure how deep this rabbit hole went, but wanting to be out more and more with every step. I kept looking down periodically, seeing if I could see a print from my brother's big rubber boots in the dust. I was looking for any sign that he had passed this way, but I was coming up with nothing so far. Then I came upon the old man. I turned a corner and found myself in a 10 by 10 park with honest-to-God grass. There was a lamppost that spilled light over the old park bench, and an old man sat on it, feeding real pigeons. As I approached, he patted the bench as though he wanted me to sit. One look at the old man told me that I did not want to sit there. He was dressed in a long coat that looked patched and frayed, a fuzzy old cap obscuring his face. He patted the seat again as I approached, but I had already decided that I would not be stopping. The whole situation was a little creepy, and I intended to just walk on and continue on my way. When his hand shot out and grabbed me, I nearly jumped a foot. His hand was covered in thick green mold, and when he looked up, I could see the same mold growing on his face. He grinned his gap-toothed smile at me, and for a moment I thought it was Mr. Foskey. His grip was firm, but moist, and when I pulled away, his hand slipped off, and he sat there, grinning at me. Something clamped down on my ankle then, and I looked down to see that he was feeding rats. These were wharf rats, too, no cute pet shop mice, and as they tried to scuttle up my rubber boot, I kicked out at them and turned to run. The old man was standing then, a creaky moan coming from his dusty throat, but I was out of the park and into the tunnel again. I ran, flat out, and as I ran, I imagined I could see lights in the wall reaching out for me. Their brightness came reaching out towards me, and I ducked away from them as I came. The tunnel seemed to be nightmarishly claustrophobic as I ran, and I began taking turns at random. I had no idea where I was or where I was going. I only knew that I wanted to be out. I prayed that this tunnel would end, and I would just flop out onto the carpet in the dirty living room, that my brother would be waiting there for me. He would wonder where I had been and what had taken me so long, and we would leave and never come back to this place. Screw O'Dare, and screw his money, too. As I stopped panting, clutching the stitch in my side, I just wanted to be out. That's when I heard the footsteps. They echoed strangely up the tunnel, and they filled me with a deep sense of dread. Was it the old man coming after me? Some new horror? I didn't know, but the steps were heavy and ominous, and I knew that I did not want them to find me. I hid around the corner in a little trash alcove and shuddered in my cowardice. The steps grew closer. I was shaking all over. The footsteps were slow and knowing. I just knew it was some kind of new monster that wanted me. It was Some mold monster that was trying to invade me like it had invaded the old man. It was the old man who wanted to breathe spores into me and infect me. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't care. At that moment, I just wanted to leave, and I was willing to kill to get out of here. Clump, clump, clump. I saw a rock on the ground. Clump, clump, clump. It looked jagged, broken like a paving stone. Clump, clump, clump. I picked it up and held it against my chest. Clump, clump, clump. I closed my eyes and steeled myself for what I was about to do. Clump, 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 clump. I rounded the corner and swung the stone, and it connected with something that immediately staggered back, bellowing. I swung it again, but it hit me around the waist and drove me to the ground. I dropped the rock in the skirmish, and as it rolled away, I felt hands close around my throat. It was choking me, choking the life out of me, and as I groped around, I could see little black swirls at the corners of my vision. I swung my fist out at it, but without oxygen, it was a weak swing at best. I went back to groping, trying to find something, and finally, my hands settled on something hard and jagged. I grabbed the rock and swung it, filling my lungs with air as the hands loosened, and the shape fell away. I lifted the rock and swung it down at the shape, hitting it in the head. I straddled it, swinging it again and again and again, until it finally stopped moving. I was panting then, out of breath, covered in sweat, but I felt my breath escape in a sudden whoosh when I flipped on the headlamp. I was choking again. I could not find any air. I was straddling a human being, his face mostly caved in, but the rolled-up shirt sleeves were a dead giveaway. He was wearing our shirt, the shirt with the two happy moving men on the front, and as I threw the rock away, the tears began to flow. I jumped off him and ran, leaving him in the tunnel to God only knows what. I ran in a blind panic. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and I just kept running. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs heaved. I bumped into the walls and saw them crumble around me. As they fell, I felt the trap envelop me. I embraced the entombing refuse as my fate. I had killed my brother. I deserved to be encased in garbage for all eternity. I deserved it. I deserved it. I could see flashing lights and was aware of being carried. I opened my eyes to see two paramedics rolling me into an ambulance. Chuck was following behind them, clearly panicked. Philip was there too, but he looked more aggravated than worried. As we drove away in the ambulance, I looked around. They seemed to become aware that I wasn't unconscious. What happened? I asked, and the two of them filled me in. Philip had come out after dark to check on our progress. After finding the house mostly still cluttered, he had called Chuck and told him to get down there. The house was still a disaster, and his workers were nowhere to be found. When Chuck arrived, they found me passed out in the living room under a pile of garbage. They had called the paramedics, fearing I had broken my neck, and had then come to check me out. "Para says you're lucky to be alive, honestly," said Chuck. Philip elbowed him, wanting him to shut up. "Why?" I asked. He said the whole place was crawling with black mold. It was around the crown of the ceiling, the baseboards. Hell, the whole place was ate up. It's a good thing your brother left early, eh? I told Chuck I didn't remember him leaving. I told him about the bedroom, the tunnel, the strange things I'd seen there. I don't think Chuck believed me, but they did go back to the house to look for him. They came to see me in the hospital later that night, told me they hadn't seen a hide nor hair of him. He wasn't at home. They'd called Dad, and his truck was still at Chuck's place. They didn't know where he was, but they were sure he would turn up. I didn't answer that. A week later, they let me go, and I went back to the house. It's still a mess. The guys Philip got to clean it aren't as diligent as my brother and I, but they're great at leaving doors unlocked. I stood before the bedroom door like I expected it to open on its own and suck me in. It didn't, and when I finally opened it, I found not a tunnel, but a cluttered bedroom on the other side. Just a bedroom. No tunnel, no monsters, just a regular old bedroom. It's been 2 weeks, and no one's seen my brother. He's lying dead in some weird trash tunnel with his head caved in. A part of me knows this, but a part of me also knows that there is no trash tunnel behind that door. I don't know what to do. Dad is getting worried. The police have no leads, and I can't find the tunnel. I killed him. It's my fault, but if I tell people the story, they're going to lock me up in Golden View right along with Mr. Foskey. I went to visit him a few days ago. No one's monitoring who visits the residence at Golden View. When I asked him about the trash tunnel and the glowing mold, he just stared at me blankly. I begged him to tell me, screamed at him to help me find my brother, but whatever light was in Mr. Foskey when I was in his English class is gone now. Now he just sits in the day room and watches soap operas with the rest of them. I don't know what to do. How do I get my brother back? What will happen to whatever poor sap buys the house next when they open that door? Will they find their familiar bedroom? Or will they be the next victim of the... She walks through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong, black, and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses written over 5 years, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labor of love that would remain my final mystery. But the poem's subject is, herself, a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who steals a little more of my soul every night, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through the silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mold my burgeoning talent while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage hormones. For years, I'd been told that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that it lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. That's what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment, a short story about the ideas of servitude but not slavery, right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper. Miss Harper had often told me that I had talent, and told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the writer trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic table outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of those threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before, and dreamed vividly as I did sometimes. In the dreams, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day, I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey at school in your underwear sort of thing, but the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater sometimes, everything having a slightly wavy feeling to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive, but at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world. Several times as I whipped around suddenly, I could see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me 2 things. She was human, and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me. Her very secrecy, humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her, not turning to speak or looking for her, but just studying her out of the corner of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple white shirt with no particular design. She seemed to be about my age, but could have been older, I suppose. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in my mind. Like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote those 4 lines. I wouldn't revisit her for another 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelter is not solely her own. I have seen what lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl was what I had named her after the second verse, had lit a fire in me, it seemed. Suddenly, I wrote pieces for every school contest, submitted poems for every poetry club event, and I gained a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that followed in those circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers noticed my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside of my high school community. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days, crafting the perfect poem, the most significant work of my life. When I hit send on the submission email, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the efforts of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into the deep and untroubled sleep of the dead for 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of the high school and saw the ethereal backdrop of my dream again. I was comfortable here. It was comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was a change from the steady flow of ideas and couplets running through my head lately. But something was missing. I looked behind me, expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me. But she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember truly being alone in this place. And it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed. But I felt my steps taking me steadily into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream would take me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed the place's unusual stillness. Thump, 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 then silence. A few minutes or hours or days would pass, and then it would happen again. Thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the thumping was probably coming from the boiler room. It was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians for storing extra chemicals or broken machinery that they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of a less academic cast went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realized I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handle, though, I was immediately thrown backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling through that door. It was her, the dream girl, and she turned to glare at me, teeth bared in a feral challenge. When she saw who I was, she stopped growling and scrambled down the hall towards my English class. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listened to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. I'm familiar with lucid dreaming, and probably led to me becoming a little too comfortable in this dream. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realized a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of those fears, and as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first few words of our strange relationship, "If you don't want to die, then you'd better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later, we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors. It sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us, chewing up everything that got in its way. My guide took us down a hallway that led to another hallway that led to another hallway, taking corners at random before finally wrenching open the door to the custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She closed the door behind us, cracking it a little as she peeked out into the hallway. All I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall becoming tired in a dream before, and as I sat, I realized my butt still hurt where I had hit it. I wanted to ask things, wanted to know what was chasing us, and why it was chasing us, but as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway as a creature like nothing I had ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was shadow. It was darkness. And as its form slither crawled past us, I looked at its amorphous boundlessness. She closed the door quietly before it came even with us, and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" She looked at me quizzically, and I feared that she was incapable of hearing me for a moment. I would later come to realize how long it had been since she had actually had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savor the sounds my words made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell that it likes. And when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me, "I don't know. I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here." Her voice was thick with disuse, but it was cultured with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me that she believed she was 16, but she couldn't be sure. She told me that she'd been here for as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. "Between dreams?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Instead of telling me, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall started to melt away. Suddenly, there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness. We were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on to infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into the landscape of fragrant technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school closed. "Where are we?" She shrugged. "Some other dream. She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know we're here." I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organize right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me, and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks, 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of a precipice, looking at the world from afar. I am a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as dazed relief. They thought I was happy. They thought I was living in the clouds. In my mind, however, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analyzing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream, and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that had led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped, but it was no use. 2 weeks later, I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt, the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused, I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in the high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, like old dust or sour memories or the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice I heard relief. "Her world lies alongside my own, my dreams the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed." She took me back to the field of flowers. Then she answered my questions. I asked her probably about 1,000,000 questions as we sat together in the field. She had found a tree that sprang from the flowers, and we sat there as she told me her story. Till that moment, I believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years. But as she spoke, her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I guess. I now realize she was afraid that telling it to me would make it real. She'd had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember there being a before. She had dreamed inside a castle and was a princess, with knights and wizards at her command, dragons and goblins that needed slaying. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favor. Sometimes she put on armor and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them. You can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world, the after. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time. Years, she said. Then, one day, something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edge of her kingdom, and it had actually killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always come along to heal them. When they didn't come back, and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights, it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it just looked wrong. I hid inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She'd thrown her splayed hand out against the wall of the castle as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared in the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she jumped through it without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind, her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep actually, but as for eating and drinking, she found that she didn't need those things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, but she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was one of the first people to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed her, believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her for my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell them who she was. They believed that she was someone at the school that I was spending my nights with. I had people who had read my works asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave them very little information. For her part, I could tell that she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get too close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I could scarcely describe them. But she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasions, though, and I remembered being filled with a warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our nights would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us and screamily suck his way around, groping, as we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him and said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that she would never really be safe as long as it existed. As time passed, I noticed her become more and more melancholy. The one night I asked what was troubling her, she took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like 1,000 years. I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that I won't be left alone when the dawn comes. I want to leave this place. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life. She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. She longs to leave her forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps. I was in my senior year when she left forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know so well, and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep. When she turned to look at me, though, I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realized that something had happened while I was gone. I think I need to destroy the shade. She detailed her plans, how if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of life, but she wouldn't hear of it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. I thought you were different. I thought you understood how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going, with or without you. She walked out, and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I found myself fighting sleep for the next few days. By then, I was almost out of high school, about to start college, in fact, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since early in the year. I woke up to my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days, I drank coffee, took caffeine pills. My face stung from where I had slapped it, and I fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me, but the thought that she might become something worse after she killed the shade scared me even more. Eventually, I lost the battle, and I was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one. The silence was oppressive. In the ethereal halls, I wonder. The only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom, every mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name as I threw caution to the wind, wanting nothing but the solace of her voice, of her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, to apologize for my cowardice. A cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar. But I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going into that basement to settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem, and if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so he can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl. It was an accident. It could have happened to anyone, which makes me wonder why it had to happen to me. I've worked construction for years. I've never so much as gotten a deep cut or broke a bone. Bruises sometimes, minor cuts. Nothing that stopped me from coming in the next day, though. It was just a typical day, really. I was performing an inspection, chatting with a buddy on a side job, and listening to the sound of an active construction site as it thrummed around me. Insurance would try to prove that I hadn't been wearing my safety gear, but I had witnesses that could attest that I'd been wearing my goggles, my hard hat, and my OSHA-approved gear when it happened. The drug test they had submitted me to showed I had nothing stronger in my system than the bagel I'd had for breakfast. It wasn't the fault of anyone besides whoever attached the rebar to that girder, I suppose. Even then, it wasn't really the welder's fault. It had simply come loose and stood there, waiting for me to get careless. On that day, I turned suddenly as I was inspecting an area of the basement, when a jutting piece of rebar, which I had made note of 1,000 times, pierced my safety goggles and stabbed right into my left eye. The members of my crew found me on the floor of the basement as I started to scream. The piece of rebar had gone through my goggles due to a slight fracture in the lens. That, plus my forward momentum, had caused the lens to break and my eye to be punctured. The rebar, as it happens, had been covered in dust. The dust caused the cut to become infected with a virulent strain of bacteria and ultimately required the removal of my eye. I tell you all this to explain how I came to be in a hospital bed, minus an eye, and strapped to the bed as soon as I finish writing this, since they fear I might be a danger to myself. But that's getting a little ahead of the story, I guess. It started the first night after I lost my eye. I'd been rushed to the ER right away, and the prognosis had been bad almost at once. There was definitely damage. There was the virulent strain of bacteria in the wound that was reacting badly. It was decided that it would be best if the eye was removed immediately to save the rest of my face. They were keeping me overnight to monitor the wound, make sure they got all the bacteria out, make sure the wound was healing properly as well. I remember laying there before I drifted off, trying to come to terms with my new vision and wondering how different my life would be with only one eye. When I drifted off, I was suddenly greeted by something terrible. I was looking through a single eye, staring up at a red, unbroken sky the color of old flames. Long runners of fire, falling stars they looked like, were cascading down, and I could hear a thundering as my point of view shook with the near-constant vibration. I was low, making me think I was less than an inch tall, and though I could look around, I couldn't move. Things were moving around me, though, creatures of perverted geometry. They lumbered about as though every step pained them greatly. As I watched them, something long and spidery, like a needle with wings, descended on me, its long proboscis growing as it landed astride my point of view. As the needle came down towards me, I woke up screaming. The nurses tried to calm me down, telling me I had just had a nightmare, and I tried to drift back off to sleep, visions of that smoldering place still in my head. The next time I closed my eyes, I was staring up at that crimson sky again. The fire was still raining down, but now I was staring at an absolute horror of a creature as it cocked its head in a nearly feline curiosity. It looked almost skeletal, like a Halloween decoration that moved a little too well. As I watched it, it scuttled a little closer, stalking my point of view. Its eye sockets were bare, I thought, but the closer it got, the better I could see a pair of bright yellow pinpricks in the depths of those cavernous sockets. Its ink-black tongue would flick out every now and again so it could moisten its seemingly bony lips. It was skulking in on 6 strangely jointed legs, and it reminded me of Toothless from the How to Train Your Dragon movies. Well, Toothless's skeleton, at least. It cocked its head as it towered over me, but when it opened its mouth, I felt another scream break through my sleeping lips. Its mouth was like a garbage disposal full of teeth, 2 sets spinning in a circular buzzsaw pattern as it hissed and screamed at me. The screams could have broken glass, and my ears actually started bleeding as it screeched over me. The head snapped down, strange teeth covering my point of view, and I woke up to 2 orderlies restraining me. That's when someone stuck a needle in my neck, and I was left in a mercifully dreamless sleep. But dreams, it seems, were the least of my worries that night. I was treated to that same sky, that same damn amber sky, until the drugs wore off. In that time, I saw those lumbering giants make their way across the blasted land. I saw human beings, too, as they made their way across the blasted land, some of them trampled by the lumbering behemoths, or hunted and maimed by those skeletal horrors. Little burnt tan creatures, almost like frogs that had learned how to walk, capered about, shoving and kicking at the naked, stumbling humans that walked about confusedly. Their skin was seared, their bodies bleeding, but no matter what happened to them, they just kept screaming and writhing in endless pain. The vision went on, an endless hell that I was forced to watch as the world on the other side moved on. I don't know if it was heaven or hell, but the only thing that remained the same was the crimson sky and the burning rain. The rest of that day, I was kept in a medical-induced state, living in that hell and seeing its atrocities. In that time, it felt as though I slept for years. Time had no meaning in that place, and the lumbering beasts became a sort of rude clock for me. They would lumber by periodically, and I would mark that as an hour. Their footsteps would shake the ground, making my peripheral shudder, and my vision felt like ripples on a pond. Of the strange skeletal creatures, there was very little to see after the first one. None of them approached me again. The mosquito creatures kept their distance as well. I suppose they hadn't found me particularly tasty, so they were content to leave me alone. That was until one of the little brown creatures came to investigate. I'd been staring at that amber sky for 2 passes of the lumbering beasts when a face that only a mother could love swam up out of the void. It was so sudden that I yelped internally, not really sure what to do now that something living had come close again. Nothing had come to bother me for so long that I had begun to think my position was going to remain this dull little space until I eventually came out of this state. The ugly, lumpy creature bent down, bringing its face very close to my position, before wrapping a hand around me and bathing me in far too welcoming darkness. Light peeked through the fingers as we ran, but that seemed to be the point where the drugs were beginning to wear off, and I started to come out. I squinted my remaining eye at the heavy rays of the afternoon sun, and felt my stomach rumble at the tray that sat before me. When the nurse came in, smiling, as she watched me eat, I asked her how long I had been out for. I expected it to be a week, maybe a month, but she told me it had been about 12 hours. It felt as though I had spent years in that terrible place, counted out days' worth of hours by the passing of the creatures, and I felt that I never wanted to go back there again. I wasn't sure if it was the act of sleeping or just the act of closing my eyes, but I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself from sleep. That wasn't particularly hard. I had been asleep for 12 straight hours. But as the night wound on, that feeling of heavy eyelids became harder and harder to ignore. The TV shows became a little less stimulating, the bed became a little more comfortable, and my head began to dip and slide towards my chest. They wouldn't let me have any coffee for some reason, no stimulants at all, and the water was cutting it not at all. I made it till just after sunrise, somehow, but as I slipped into unconsciousness, I was greeted with something worse than I could have ever imagined. As I slipped off, I was treated to the worst vision yet. I was sitting high up now, in a throne room straight from the mind of Wes Craven, When they speak of otherworldly geometry in Lovecraft, I have to believe they've seen this place. Nothing was equal, nothing congruent. The angles hurt to look at, the edges were like razor blades, and the building was either made by a madman or someone who was driven mad by its construction. When you read this, you won't understand, but I ask you to try. The room looked like it was designed to inspire anxiety, foster nightmares, put the inhabitants on edge until madness swallowed them whole. The whole room was a dirty white. It wasn't off-white. It wasn't a dark white. It was a filthy white. I had seen the way windows look when they're caked with mud, and that was this color. It made my skin crawl, or it would have if I'd had any skin at that moment. The color was throughout. The feeling it gave me, coupled with the anxiety from the construction I was now inside of, made me want to shudder and vomit at the same time. It was filled with pews, which were piled with the muddy frog creatures I'd seen before. They were all manner of sizes, their lumpy bodies pressed into those seats as they sat there in rapture of me, it seemed. They were dressed strangely in garments I can only describe as fancy rags, and as I watched, the show began. A line of naked, screaming people were dragged forward, unclothed brown creatures prodding them with sticks as they looked at me in horror. These people were in terrible shape. The best among them were bruised and dirty, but some of them were lucky to be standing. I could see bodies burned down to the white meat, bones poking from them, eyes and limbs missing. But the most horrifying part was how these injuries didn't seem to bother them. They were filthy and afraid, but I got the feeling that their injuries were secondary in their mind. As the first one was pushed towards me, the brown creature opened its mouth and spoke with a voice like a well filled with water. "We have rounded up these cattle for punishment, my lord." I was confused as the dark-haired man, who was roughly my age, stumbled forward, but I wouldn't have long to revel in that lack of knowledge. "Who dares to trespass within my realm?" I heard it, and turned, though I had no body. I was held aloft on a pedestal, and the creature beside me seemed to be my captor. It was beyond all earthly description, but I will try. Imagine one of those Jim Henson Skeksis had all the skin burned off of it, down to the bone, and then had the flesh reapplied badly with red and brown Play-Doh. Its eyes were piss-yellow slits. Its jaws were beak-like and sharp-looking, and its flesh appeared to be oozing as it spoke in a thick, deep voice like a frog at the bottom of a ravine. It spoke to the brown creatures, telling them how they wanted the people tortured, and then, suddenly, it noticed me. Turning its head, it smiled as it saw me looking at it, and its pleasure was even worse than its anger somehow. "See what awaits you, human. Witness and despair." It croakingly hissed out these words at me. I came awake, screaming again, and thankfully, they didn't put me under this time. I've been in the restraints for 4 days now. They transferred me to a psychiatric ward, and the straps were to stop me from digging at my skin. I've been awake for 4 days, refusing to go to sleep because every time I nod off, I'm returned to that hateful place. I gaze upon that creature as he passes judgment, never sleeping, never leaving, and I wake up screaming. I've begged my doctors not to sedate me, but I think they will before long. I'm writing this under heavy supervision, trying to explain to my doctors since words seem to have failed me. I'm hoping he understands that, despite my state, I don't want to hurt myself. I've seen what lies beyond, and it's not something I'm in any hurry to get to.